You're watching TelecomTV's exclusive video coverage of Broadband World Forum 2015 from London. And I'm joined now by Gary Bolton, who is VP Global Marketing with Adtran. Gary, thanks for joining us on TelecomTV.
Great to be here in London, Guy.
2015, a new year, a new venue for Broadband World Forum. What's the industry talking about? We're gathered here. What are the main talking points in the broadband community?
Yeah, well, no surprise, but here at Broadband Forum, everybody's excited about more bandwidth. And so one of the things this year we're seeing is GFast is real, and it's here. We're in over 50 trials right now with GFast, and that's one of the most exciting things that we're seeing in our stand. A lot of interest there. And so it's not only GFast, but it's also GPON. So one of the other things that we're showing in our stand is what we call XGPON2, or excuse me, XGS-PON, which is NGPON2, but it's a more cost-effective version that's now in the ITU standards. So we're being able to demo 10 gig by 10 gig symmetric PON. The other things, is just how do you get more bandwidth to places more cost-effectively, and so things like vectoring and super vectoring are also incredibly popular. And then as we move to these more networks of being able to get into this whole SDN, NFV world, what we have been promoting, we put out a press release this morning talking about unlocking the network, and that's really promoting open interfaces. So one of the things like with our GFast, we're the first vendor in the industry to have open interfaces on our DPUs, so we can work with any OLT or we can work with any other CPE. And so what this allows operators, rather than get locked in with having to have an end-to-end single vendor, that they can pick and choose the best components from any vendor. And so we're really having some good success in trying to drive the industry towards more open standards and open interfaces.
So what's happening in the GPON market?
Yeah, so what we're seeing is that gigabit is really taking off. Not as much in Europe, but in the US, we're seeing lots of gigabit communities and a drive for more and more bandwidth, and I can talk a little bit later on why that is. But so, GPON has been pervasively deployed, but now what we're seeing is how do you get more and more bandwidth. And so NGPON2 is the standard for the next generation, and that's 10 gig by 10 gig symmetric PON. The challenge with NGPON2 is it's about 7 to 8 times more expensive than GPON. And so as you know, fiber to the home, the biggest challenge is the economics and how you get the business case to prove in. And so now if you multiply the cost times 7 or 8x, then it becomes we're never going to get to scale and volumes. And so what we did is we focused our innovation on is how do we get 10 gig symmetric PON at GPON economics. And so what we've been able to do is have a way to do that, and we've adopted that or had it introduced at the ITU standards, and this new standard is called XGS-PON. X being 10, G is gigabit, and S symmetric. And so that is it is NGPON2, but with fixed optics. So it's a subset of the full NGPON2. So it allows you then, as you move to tunable optics, which you might be able to use in business and other more premium services, it gives you that whole evolution path. So you're able to deliver 10 gig by 10 gig symmetric PON, and we're demoing that today in our booth. And so that will be going out into production next year. So this is a real exciting time. And what's really interesting is the first guys that called us up and showed up at our place to see XGS-PON were the guys already deploying gigabit. And so you'd think that how much bandwidth you need, but the answer is more. And so we haven't seen a limit on what satisfies the need for bandwidth.
What about those network operators that don't have fiber all the way to individual premises? They're reliant upon established and installed copper. They're looking at technologies, I guess, like GFast and maybe vectoring to increase speeds. Are they able to offer a competitive kind of level of service?
Well, absolutely, and that's where we see in Europe is that you see a lot of, we call it fiber to X technology, but it's really, if you think of GFast, we would consider that a fiber to the premise, because you're able to get your fiber optics all the way to a building, and then leverage GFast to be able to have gigabit speeds within a multi-tenant building. But also, what we're seeing is that in Europe, where you have high density and historic areas, it's very difficult to get the last few hundred meters. And so you're able to get gigabit level speeds over the last few hundred meters of copper. Now, one of the things that's real exciting is now we've been in over 50 trials, and what we're seeing in the industry is that GFAST is performing much better than anybody thought. And so not only we were thinking you had to deploy it at the distribution point, so that last touch point before it went into the premise, but now you can actually move that back to the cabinet, which that reduces the number of locations dramatically. And so that really improves the business case, and that's why you're seeing all the major operators are really excited about G.fast.
When we talk about speeds and we're going up to gigabit speed levels, we say, well, what's driving this? What's the reason for it? Is a lot of this to do with home workers? It's the way businesses are relocating and restructuring rather than consumers playing games, downloading videos?
It's funny. I wrote a blog recently called the Smart Cities Paradox, and basically, smart city is, all the good jobs and everybody's moving to the city, and so to be able to support all this high density, you have to have a very efficient and use gigabit infrastructure to be able to support, all these people in one location. But what we find is the more bandwidth you provide, the less people need to move to the city, and they can actually live in places that provide a better quality of life, and without having commutes and not have to worry about all the issues that come with being in a high dense environment. So there's something like the economic development aspects of gigabit, but the other thing that we're seeing is if you look at the composition of the internet traffic, about 68% of that traffic is video in the U.S. And so that's largely driven by YouTube and Netflix. But when you look in Europe, it's only about 45% of the composition is video. And so when I started drilling into that, I realized it's really not 45% anywhere. It's either 25% or 68%. And what that has to do in Europe is where Netflix is available. So if where Netflix is available, you have a high usage of over-the-top video. And so what I think is going to happen is that, in the U.S. we've already seen with Google Fiber and, as a catalyst, a lot of over-the-top video usage. We'll start to see more and more of that in Europe.
So the term gigabit community, gigabit cities, is not just marketing. This is real, and people really want it, are using it, are showing that there's a need for it. There's no turning back here. We are going gigabit.
Exactly. So, Guy, last year, about August last year, we launched an initiative called Enabling Communities, Connecting Lives. And what this is all really is more focused on economic development, by how to use gigabit infrastructure to really change the lives of people in small communities. And so what we had a goal of enabling over 50 gigabit communities by the end of last year, and then with the target of reaching over 200 gigabit communities by the end of this year. We already passed that 200 mark back in August. So what we're seeing is not only is there a big adoption of gigabit, but it's accelerating. And really what this is these communities, so they're either, you have this very small rural areas that have federal subsidies, and that's the Connect America plan, CAF they call it, and that's driving funding in to get fiber to the home to those very small communities. And then you have the Google cities, what we call the NFV cities, and this is where Google Fiber is putting in, and then they're getting matched with a CenturyLink or a AT&T, and putting in gigabit infrastructure. But then you have kind of middle America that Google's not going to show up at, or they don't have federal subsidies, and those towns are basically used to be a steel town or used to be a textile town or was a farming town, and they're finding that if they don't change, provide some focus on economic development, that these towns will cease to exist. And so by putting in gigabit infrastructure, then it really has completely changed around the dynamics of those towns, and people have then moved in from Silicon Valley or other places. And what happens is when you have this infrastructure, then people come in and they start to incubate new startups and innovation. And then innovation, they have their suppliers, and those suppliers need hospitality. So they have to have restaurants, they have to have hotels, and this really starts to feed itself. And it's been highly successful. Areas like Comporium and Rock Hill, South Carolina. We've seen it in the Midwest. We're seeing things like in Indiana, for example, farming, whether dairy farming with Nitco, or it's just agriculture, is these guys are all big data. You think about farmers, these guys, every penny counts in being able to mine big data. And so when you think about the Internet of Things, you got to think of farming. And so they need to know exactly what the biometrics are on their animals. They need to know what the moisture content is in their soil. And so they have to use these gigabit infrastructures to be able to optimize their production.
Is it purely a case of informing the local operators or whoever is operating the networks of what's possible, what technologically is possible, or is there more to it? Do you have to work with finances and subsidies and things to really push out volume?
Well, so it depends, on which market and which segment you're working in. So obviously, like a rural area, and they're working with the Connect America funds, or any of the, whether it's in Australia or Europe, where they're using government subsidies and funding, it's all within the rules. So it's being able to figure out how to tweak those rules. And so I spend a lot of time up in Washington working with the FCC. And for example, the Connect America Fund, the first round of funding, we only had 38% of the funds were accepted by the carriers. So all this money sat on the sidelines because the rules, there's too many strings attached. And so being able to go in and work with the operator or the FCC and say, okay, here's the goal we're trying to make, and here's what makes sense, here's what doesn't make sense. And they are very open. We have a very strong CTO organization. We can provide a lot of research and really be able to get the right rules adopted. As a result, CAF2, which just came out in August 26, we had 89% of the carriers took 89% of the money available. And really the only major carrier that didn't take the money was Verizon. They just took a small part for some properties getting acquired by Frontier. So I would say it was wildly successful based on, so that's one way, is just making sure the rules work. But from a kind of the enabling communities, connecting lives, these are towns with a desperate need to really how do we drive economic development. And so what we saw from the Fiber to the Home Council is they did a study and found that gigabit infrastructure provides 1.1% GDP improvement. So that if you think about 2% GDP is basically trading water, if you can add 1.1 basis points on top of that, that's pretty amazing to really stimulate the growth of a community. And then with the others, we see competitive response. So whether it's competitive response to Google or...
I was going to say, it is a knock-on effect of this also that it encourages more competition, and those operators that aren't providing this level of service then have to up the game.
Well, exactly. So we used to have operators. It's kind of funny how this world's changed. Is trying to argue how much bandwidth do you need, and the answer is more. And so what we saw is that operators, when they're trying to go out and launch gigabit, they're like, well, should we do tiered services? And some of the operators say, no, we'll just offer a gigabit. And they really found that the marketing value of offering a gigabit was more powerful than trying to tier it up. And so that's why they're anxious to offer 2 gigabit and 10 gigabit, because what they're seeing is if you're trying to win over new subscribers, you have to provide a really compelling offer. And so the feedback we're getting is if you can provide 100 megabits that can hold your customers, and a gigabit really is what is going to grab market share. And so what we're seeing by a lot of our customers is what we call the halo effect, is they'll go out and they'll deploy gigabit, and so all the marketing and announcements and all the excitement around gigabit, and then they'll use copper-based technologies, so bonding, vectoring, and so forth, to be able to get 100 meg to the surrounding areas that's cost effective. And so as you drive all that revenue, then it allows you to be able to move your fiber deeper and deeper.
Now, all this, and it's a multi-vendor world now, and we're seeing technologies, SDN and NFV, are really pushing this forward, and operators are able to choose up from a lot of different vendors. What are you doing to kind of support this multi-vendor architecture and approach?
Yeah, well, a couple things have gone on. So if you look at the way the industry's gone, is not too long ago it used to be that software is free and all the value was in hardware, right? So that world's changed, and now hardware's free, and now you have to figure out at some point how do you get the differentiation in value on software. And so, Adtran, we implemented Agile as far as our R&D development about 2011. And so our whole company moved over to an Agile development. And today, 82% of all R&D efforts are software-based. And if you look at even the composition of we spend about 21% of our revenue back into R&D. So we're very R&D heavy. And not too long ago, all R&D was done in the U.S. Now, almost nearly half of R&D is done outside the U.S. So we have about 35% in Germany, and then about 18% of R&D is done in India, and then the rest is in other places. So India is really key as well, because if you think of that's the IT epicenter of the world, and so really being able to grow and develop those R&D capabilities is key. And so when I mentioned press release we had today was on being able to have these open interfaces, and that's really what we think is key, is to being able to have a multi-vendor network and be able to allow service providers to not get locked in. So we have this whole unlock campaign about being able to, today with our fiber to the home, our OLTs, it's in the head end, can interoperate with anybody else's ONT, as well as our ONTs can interoperate with, if it's Alcatel or Huawei or someone else's OLT, and then also on our ONTs, our DPUs, we support multi-vendor CP. So this really allows a service provider to not get stuck with a single vendor approach. But then as we move forward, as I said, we've been really focused on software for quite some time, and so now we've been really in position now to virtualize key functions of our products, and so now we're moving more to VNF bundles, so we can start to bundle those capabilities and then be able to, whether it's our routers or switches, and then as we move into virtual CPE and virtual OLTs, and to really focus on what the differentiation is and be able to do that in software.
Terrific. Gary, thank you very much indeed.
Guy, it was a real pleasure.